that the U.S. is going to remain competitive and the world is going to grow is if we adhere to rules and in a multilateral fashion. One of the challenges that this current administration has with China is it's taking on China bilaterally, and it's taking China on with tariffs alone. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, if you look at the WTO accession agreement that signed at China in 2001, it's in violation of that. So we've in the last couple of years, we've thought about things bilaterally. That may work in the real estate business, but it doesn't work in trade. Yeah. Numbers about climate change, that is increasingly important, not just for people who are younger than we are, who really are worried about this, but even corporations and boards, and I would suggest that they should be concerned about it because it has a very direct economic impact on the bottom line. I think the overarching issue that boardrooms should be discussing has to do with this whole notion of decoupling. And decoupling is usually thought of as, are we going to be pulling away from China? Are countries going to begin to work inward within the international trading system? And frankly, I think that worries me greatly, but for boards, what I've been doing is talking about how do you diversify your supplies and your purchases far more than you have done in the past, because I do think even if there's a change in administration at the executive branch, obviously one needs to have a change on Capitol Hill as well. We would like to see this democracy work again. Nothing, I believe, is going to change in the short run because some of the cats are out of the bag. And I think the profound question is, and you alluded to this in your opening, Dean, is we used to have a police called the WTO. The WTO is not this group of dark state people making rules. The WTO is actually a group of countries. Mm-hmm. And the WTO, unfortunately, because you have the two largest economies now working outside the WTO, in many examples, that rules-based trading system, in a scenario where businesses are thinking about decoupling, that's a lot to digest. And and we have not just perhaps leadership questions in this country, but we have leadership questions in other allies on the trade side who have been part of a market-friendly environment, such as the Brits, for instance. What's going to happen in Canada? I don't know. But what has broken down is not just the WTO, but people actually working together in a multilateral fashion, even if the WTO weren't there. And the world has changed in terms of the economies and the network economies, and we can't just go it alone. And sooner or later, this light bulb is going to reignite again, but it's going to require collective action. And what makes me very nervous when I look out and talking with boards or CEOs about the economic and policy landscape is we don't have that collective action framework in place about in this country. And I just don't know what it's going to take, but that is a win-win investment in our national competitiveness. The reason that the United States is as competitive as it is that we have a unified economic space, right? And you just need to drive in New York or Washington, and then you need to drive in Accra and Ghana or Nairobi, and you're going to find nicer roads in relatively poorer countries than you find in this country. And the fact that every administration, every Congress says we're going to put funds together for infrastructure, it's a win-win because it boosts, the economies of scale and scope of our industries. It's labor intensive. It just, and I'd like to figure out why aren't businesses, why aren't boardrooms stepping up in an advocacy role to make this case? Because it's a classic, as an economist, it's a classic public good argument, right? Everybody wins, but then there are free riders. Well, this is why you have government, right? And it could be at a very micro level of infrastructure, but we also have to think about it across the nation. And to me, that's just like global warming, I would say infrastructure is the one issue that bedevils thinking straight about how to move forward. Not just looking at the world in terms of risk. How can we mitigate risk, but how can we grow while mitigating risk? And that may sound trite, but I've been to enough board meetings where there's like, we have a cyber problem, we have a supply chain problem. Who is thinking at the board level, where's the next wave of growth for my company going to come from? Mm-hmm. And go through those kinds of scenarios. And one of the things that leaps out at me, having done surveys of who composes boards, the composition of these boards, is you find very few boards, frankly, who have people with lots of operational experience in some of these markets. You might have someone, like us who served in government, but you also might have people who, also like us, who are in the private sector and have done investments. And, when you look around the boardroom table, you have to wonder, who is the person or a couple of people who really have a sense of what's going on, because we don't live in an economy anymore that is an island, we all know that. But the globe has changed significantly, I believe, in the last 2 years from a policy perspective, and boards need to have people who understand what does that mean in terms of growth, where are the opportunities, and where are the risks. But first and foremost, you're worried about your competitors, right? And it should not be a discussion at the audit committee. There should be a growth committee as well. I mean, there's got to be, the DNA of the board has got to be fixated on how are we going to grow. That infrastructure is always talked. And what's ironic, I think, is of all places, as the rest of the advanced countries largely have turned protectionist, indeed playing outside of the WTO, both the US, China, and some other countries, the African continent has just embarked on a really groundbreaking policy of creating a continental free trade area, where you're going to have 54 of the 55 countries I've already signed up. You're going to end up with an economy in the next decade, about $2.5 trillion. The 60% of the population is going to be below the age of 25. And so I'm struck when I think about this, that the turning in terms of protection is on the advanced countries, and lo and behold, who would have thought that Africa at least would begin to make this move on a heroic scale. Now, whether Africa is successful or not, and that is another matter. But I think there's not all bleakness out there. There's a lot of bleakness, but it's not all. They are the engines of the global growth of the economy. That infrastructure is always taught.